The morning after the late Duchess was buried, Nora Finch counted the candles. It was the only task she had been given. The Wyndham household ran on precision, and in the week since Lady Harriet Wyndham had died of the fever that had swept through the county in the deep of that October, the household had run on nothing but the residue of its own habits. The footman polished silver that no one would use. Cook prepared meals that arrived cold to a dining room where no one sat. And Nora counted candles, moving through the great house at Ashbourne Park with her ledger pressed flat against her chest, noting in her careful hand which rooms had been emptied of wax and which had been left untouched. She had come to Ashbourne Park 14 months ago as lady's maid to the new Duchess, the young woman the county had watched with cautious admiration as she was handed out of a hired carriage and into the arms of a marriage that had been arranged without her consultation. Nora had been hired from the village, had known the Wyndham estate only as a grey stone presence on the hill above her father's farm, and she had been grateful for the position. She was 23, the third daughter of a man whose land had gone to debts when the harvest failed twice in 3 years, and gratitude was the appropriate response to any position at all. She had learned quickly that the Wyndham household was a place where things were not said. It was a house that held its silences like a held breath, the kind of silence that is not peace, but restraint. The Dowager Duchess of Wyndham, Edmund Wyndham's mother, Lady Cecilia, had been the first to take Nora's measure. She had done it the morning of Nora's arrival, in the entrance hall, in front of the assembled upper staff, looking Nora over with the particular quality of attention one gives to a new piece of furniture, whose proportions one suspects are slightly wrong. "You are the village girl," Lady Cecilia had said, not unkindly, merely as a fact, the way one would note a change in weather. Nora had said that she was, my lady. "Well," Lady Cecilia had said, "you will do for Harriet. She does not require a great deal." It had been spoken as a dismissal, which it was, and also as a category into which Nora was placed. The village girl, the serviceable maid, the kind of person one acquired as a convenience rather than a choice. Nora had understood the category immediately and had stepped into it without argument, because argument was not a tool available to a woman in her position, and because she understood, with the clarity that comes from having observed the world from its lower edges, that categories are most efficiently subverted by inhabiting them so thoroughly that the person who assigned them eventually forgets to maintain them. She had been very good at her position. She had been fond of the young Duchess, a quiet woman from Shropshire whose family had needed the alliance, and who had needed, in return, a companion rather than a maid. Nora had been both, and she had been discreet. Discretion, in the Wyndham household, was the cardinal virtue, the quality without which all others were valueless. The candle count brought her to the east corridor on the morning after the funeral. She stopped at the door of the room that had been the Duchess's bedchamber, the room where Lady Harriet Wyndham had died, and she stood with her hand resting on the doorframe for a moment, not entering, simply standing. The room was cool and still. The fire had not been lit in 4 days. The maids had changed the linens, but had not opened the curtains, and the morning light came through the heavy brocade as a thin line along the floor. She had been in this room many times. She had helped Lady Harriet dress and undress in this room for 14 months. She had brought warm water and tonic at midnight when the headaches came, and she had sat in the chair by the window while the Duchess slept in those first months, when sleep would not come easily, and the presence of another breathing person in the room was a comfort that Lady Harriet had been too proud to ask for directly. She had never once, in 14 months, found the connecting door to the Duke's chamber standing open. She had never, in 14 months, found evidence on the Duchess's linen of anything other than ordinary occupation. She had never found a second impression on the pillow beside the first. She had never found the fire stoked at an unusual hour, or a glass of port set for two, or a book removed from the shelf and left open that she had not herself placed there. She had understood, in the careful language of such things, what this meant. She had carried the understanding the way one carries a stone in a coat pocket, aware of its weight at all times, never acknowledging it to anyone, because to name it would be to set something in motion that could not be stopped, and Nora Finch had not yet determined what the right motion was, or whether she was the right person to set it in motion at all. It was possible, she had told herself in the long months, that she had simply missed the evidence, that the Duke visited late and left before she arrived, that there were things the upper household managed that she was not privy to. She was, however, privy to a great deal, as lady's maid to a duchess who trusted her, and what Lady Harriet Wyndham had told her, in the first cold month of November of the previous year, sitting in exactly this room with her hands folded in her lap and her voice very steady, was not the kind of thing that admitted of reinterpretation. "He is very kind to me," Lady Harriet had said. "We are comfortable. I want you to understand that." Nora had understood. She had understood that what the Duchess was describing was the form of a marriage, rather than its substance. And she had held that knowledge with both hands ever since, because Lady Harriet had trusted her with it, and because the Duchess had asked for nothing more than to be understood. She moved away from the doorway now, and continued down the corridor with her ledger. If you have ever stood at the edge of a secret, and known it to be the kind of secret that reshapes the landscape of everything around it, you understand something of the quality of Nora's days in the weeks following the funeral. She did not speak of what she knew to anyone. She did not intend to. The Duchess was gone, and the secret belonged to no living person except Nora and the Duke of Wyndham himself. And the Duke was not a man who invited conversation about the architecture of his private life. Edmund Wyndham had returned to Ashbourne Park 3 days after the funeral, having gone to London on a state business that no one was impolite enough to question. He was 34 years old, tall and spare in the way of men who carry grief in their muscles rather than on their faces, with dark hair that had gone slightly gray at the temples in the year since Nora had first seen him, and eyes the color of pewter that held their focus steadily and without warmth on whatever they happened to rest on. He was not a man who inspired casual familiarity. He was not a man who invited it. He had been, by every external account, a good husband. He had been quiet and steady, and he had treated Lady Harriet with consistent courtesy. He had not humiliated her. He had not made her situation a subject of household gossip. He had not been unkind. What he had been, Nora thought, was absent. Present in the rooms of his own house, and absent from his own marriage in some fundamental way that she had not understood and did not presume to judge, because there were things that happened between two people in the beginning of a life together that could not be assessed from outside them. She assessed nothing. She counted candles and entered figures in her ledger and went about the reduced business of a house in mourning. The first time she was brought to his attention directly was a Thursday in November, 3 weeks after the funeral, when she was in the library returning a volume to the shelf that she had borrowed with permission from Mr. Briggs, the steward, who had told her in the first year that she was welcome to take books from the lower shelves so long as she kept a record and returned them in good condition. She had been returning the volume and had not heard the Duke enter, and she was on the step-stool, reaching for the upper edge of the shelf, when his voice came from the doorway. "You are the Duchess's maid." She came down from the step-stool and turned to face him. He was standing in the doorway with a letter in his hand, still in his coat, as though he had come in from outside and proceeded directly to the library without removing it, which was unusual enough to note. "I was, Your Grace," she said. I am Nora Finch." He looked at her for a moment in the way she had learned to read as assessment rather than dismissal. He was trying to place her in the household's geography. "Briggs tells me you have served well," he said, "that you were a comfort to her." "I was glad to be of use to her ladyship," Nora said. There was a pause, the kind that in a lesser man might have been awkwardness. But in him was simply silence, inhabited with the same composed attention he brought to everything. "She spoke of you," he said. "She said you were the cleverest person in the house." Nora did not quite know what to do with this. She said, quietly, that Lady Harriet had been generous. He looked at her a moment longer, then nodded once, and left. She returned the book to its place on the shelf, and stood very still for a moment after she heard his footsteps recede down the corridor. She had not expected to be noticed. She had not sought it. And yet something in the exchange had shifted the quality of the air in the room. The way a door opened briefly changes the temperature even after it is closed again. And Nora, who was honest with herself in the way one must be when one has no one else to be honest with, admitted to herself that she had felt the change. The Dowager Lady Cecilia noticed things. It was her primary occupation in the Wyndham household. She had come from London for the funeral, and remained on the grounds that Edmund required guidance in the mourning period, which was her way of saying she required to be present for whatever rearrangement of the household was about to take place. She came to the servants' hall on a Tuesday afternoon in December, which was unusual, and asked for Nora Finch. "I am told," Lady Cecilia said when Nora was brought to the small sitting room where the Dowager had established herself, "that my son has been speaking with you." Nora said that His Grace had spoken to her briefly in the library, my lady. "Yes," Lady Cecilia said. "So I heard." She held her teacup with a precise grip, both hands, the way she held everything as though it were subject to revision. "You are a village girl, and you have had an unusually good position here due to my daughter-in-law's particular preference. Now that Harriet is gone, that position will naturally need to be revisited." Nora looked at her steadily. "I understand, my lady." "I wonder if you do," Lady Cecilia said pleasantly. "A village girl who reads books and receives personal commendations from a widowed duke is a village girl who has overstepped the natural boundaries of her station, whether or not she is aware of having done so." Nora said, with the quietness that was not deference but a very careful substitute for it, that she had not sought the commendation, my lady, only to return a borrowed book. Lady Cecilia looked at her for a moment over the rim of the cup with an expression that was not hostile, precisely, but was the expression of a person who has placed a bet and is watching to see whether she was right. "See that it remains so," she said. She had not expected the Duke to speak to her again. She had adjusted her expectations accordingly and had returned to the marginal geography of the household. She was, as Lady Cecilia had accurately noted, a village girl in a position that was now without its patron, and the sensible course was to be very quiet and very useful, and to hope that she was kept on in some reduced capacity, or that she was given a reference sufficient to find a comparable position elsewhere. The sensible course was not what happened. In the second week of December, a letter arrived at Ashbourne Park addressed to the Duke of Wyndham from a solicitor in London, and Nora knew about it only because Briggs brought it to the library where the Duke was working and left the door ajar when he knocked. And Nora happened to be in the corridor with a tray of tea she had been sent to deliver. And she heard the word she had not expected to hear. Annulment. She stopped walking. The word had been spoken by the solicitor's clerk, who had traveled with the letter to deliver it in person, and it fell into the quiet of the house the way a stone falls into still water, with a weight that was disproportionate to its size. She walked on. She delivered the tea to the morning room. She went upstairs and sat on the edge of her narrow bed in the room at the top of the east wing and placed her hands flat on her knees and thought. An annulment required grounds. Among them was non-consummation. If the marriage had not been consummated, which Nora knew to be true, with a certainty that lived in 14 months of careful service, then the grounds existed. To establish them, someone would have to testify. She had not been asked. She did not know whether she would be asked. She sat with her hands flat on her knees for a long time, in the December dark, listening to the house settle around her. If you had asked Nora Finch that evening what she intended to do, she could not have told you. She did not know what the Duke intended, or what the annulment was meant to accomplish, or whether she was a person whose knowledge mattered to any of it. What she knew was that Lady Harriet had told her the truth. That the truth belonged to the Duchess, who was gone, and that how Nora held it, and for what purpose, was the only decision left to her in a life that had offered her very few. The Duke asked to see her on a Friday. He was in the study, not the library, when she was brought there by Briggs, and the difference was significant, the library being a room for reading, and the study being a room for the management of the estate, for the conduct of business that required documentation and consequence. He was standing behind the desk rather than sitting at it, which was also significant, because men sit at desks when they want the desk between them and the person across it, and he had chosen not to want that. "Miss Finch," he said, "please sit down." She sat. He remained standing for a moment, and she had the impression he was choosing his words with the same careful deliberateness he brought to all things, and that the choosing was costing him something. "I am going to speak to you plainly," he said, "because I believe you are a person who prefers plainness." She said she did, Your Grace. "You were my wife's most trusted attendant," he said. "In 14 months of service, you were in the intimate household in a way that no other servant was. I believe that you understood the nature of our marriage." He said it quietly, without inflection, the words level, his eyes on her face with that steady pewter attention that she was learning was not coldness, but a form of discipline. He was holding something in place. She did not know yet what it was. She said very carefully that she had served Lady Harriet to the best of her ability, Your Grace. "Yes," he said. "I know." A pause. "I am not asking you to betray her confidence. I want to be clear about that. I am telling you what I know to be true, so that you understand that I am not asking you to reveal anything I do not already know." Nora sat very still. He looked at her directly, as he had not quite looked at her in the library, and she saw in his face something that she had not expected to see there, which was the look of a man who had been carrying a weight for a long time and had made a decision to set it down. "The annulment is a legal formality," he said. "Harriet's family requires it for a particular provision in her father's will. There is a younger sister, unmarried, who will receive a portion if Harriet's marriage is formally annulled rather than ended by death. I intend to see that she receives it. I do not intend to allow any member of my household to testify to anything they would find distressing." Nora looked at him for a moment. "And if I were willing to testify?" she said. He was quiet. In the quiet she could hear the fire and the distant sound of wind against the eastern windows. "Then I would not prevent you," he said. "But I would want you to know that I am not asking it of you. I would not ask it of you." She said, because it was the truth and she had no other way to say it. "Lady Harriet told me she wished her sister well." Something moved across his face. She could not name it. It was the kind of movement that happens below the surface of a very controlled face, a shift in some deeper structure, and it was gone almost before she saw it. "Yes," he said. She did? He sat down then, across from her, not behind the desk, but in the chair beside it, which reduced the formality of the room by a precise degree, and she thought he was not entirely aware he had done it. Or perhaps he was very aware, and had done it, because the situation called for it. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and I want you to understand that there is no obligation in the asking." She said she was listening. "I require a companion for my mother," he said, "for the next several months, while the household is reorganized. She is not easy company, and she knows it, and she prefers someone who does not pretend she is easier than she is." A pause. "Briggs tells me you have managed her well." Nora thought of Lady Cecilia's comment about the village girl and the overstepped station. She said, with some precision, that she had endeavored to be useful to her ladyship. The corner of his mouth moved. It was not quite a smile. It was the shadow of one, the outline of where a smile might be if the circumstances were different. "She said," he said, "that you were impertinent." "Yes, Your Grace." "She said it as a compliment," he said. "I want you to know that." She did not entirely believe this, but she recognized it as an offering and received it as one. She took the position. She did not take it without hesitation, and she did not take it without the awareness that she was moving deeper into the Wyndham household, rather than toward the door that was the sensible direction. And that sensible was a value she had been revising since the November afternoon when he had looked at her in the library and told her his wife had called her the cleverest person in the house. Lady Cecilia was not easy. She was the kind of woman who had organized her entire character around the maintenance of social structure, because social structure was the only architecture she trusted, and anything that threatened the structure was a threat to the only security she had ever known. She was not cruel by disposition. She was precise and demanding, and occasionally imperious, and she expected Nora to be useful without appearing useful, which was the particular paradox of serving a person of great social confidence. Nora was useful. She managed the correspondence. She managed the callers and the cards. She managed the dowager's mornings in the way that the dowager required them managed, which meant anticipating needs before they were expressed and suppressing any evidence that the anticipation had been necessary. She was, in other words, very good at it. The Duke was present. He was, in January, present in a way that he had not been in November, and Nora registered the difference with the care she had learned to bring to all things in this household. He came to his mother's sitting room in the afternoons. He asked, when he found Nora there, about her comfort in the household and whether she had what she needed. He thanked her, once, in a voice that was lower than his usual register, for the testimony she had provided to the solicitor in the matter of the annulment, which had been given to a clerk in the steward's office and had consisted of a single paragraph in her careful hand, factual and plain, describing only what she herself had directly observed. She had not seen him read it. He thanked her for it anyway. There was a supper in January, a small gathering of the neighboring families who came to pay their respects to the house in mourning, the Hallets and the Pemberton Smiths and the Moorfield family from the valley, whose eldest daughter came in ice-blue silk and sat at the Duke's right hand at dinner, and smiled at him with the particular quality of a woman who has been told she is the correct choice and has arrived to confirm it. Miss Moorfield's name was Lavinia, and she was 22, and she had the kind of composed beauty that comes from considerable early investment, and she had been positioned by Lady Cecilia and by the Moorfield family alike as the appropriate next step in the Duke of Wyndham's social management, now that the unfortunate matter of the first marriage was being resolved. Nora observed this from her position at the end of the table, which was the position of a companion rather than a guest, close enough to observe and distant enough to be disregarded. She observed that Miss Moorfield spoke intelligently and with a polished charm that she had clearly cultivated with care. She observed that the Duke listened to her with courtesy. She observed that when he turned to say something to the gentleman on his left, he did not turn back to Miss Moorfield with the same attention he had left with. She observed that once, near the middle of the meal, he looked down the length of the table and found her, Nora, watching the room, and held the look for a moment before she turned her eyes back to her plate. She observed that her own hands were very steady. She had learned, over the course of the autumn, to keep her hands very steady. Lady Cecilia came to her sitting room the morning after the supper, with the air of someone who has come to conclude a piece of business that should have been concluded some time ago. "Miss Moorfield is a very suitable young woman," she said. Nora agreed that she seemed accomplished, my lady. "My son requires a wife who is suited to the position," Lady Cecilia said. "He requires someone from a good family, who understands what the household demands, and who will not introduce uncertainties into a situation that has already had its share of difficulty." Nora arranged the correspondence on the desk with care. "Naturally, my lady." "The village girl who reads books," Lady Cecilia said pleasantly, "is not that person." She said it without hostility. She said it as a fact, the way she had said everything since November, placing Nora in her category with a firmness that was meant to be a kindness, the kindness of clarity. Nora looked at her directly. "No, my lady," she said. "I imagine she is not." Lady Cecilia held her gaze for a moment, and in the holding was something that was almost recognition, the slight adjustment of assessment that happens when one has underestimated the quality of what one is dealing with. Then she picked up her correspondence and dismissed Nora with a nod. February brought the kind of cold that settles into stone walls and does not leave until April, and Nora found herself in the habit of working in the library in the evenings, after Lady Cecilia retired, because the library fire was larger than the one in her own room, and because the books were there, and she had been told she was welcome, and she was careful enough to read that invitation as genuine. He came in on a Tuesday evening in February and found her in the chair by the window with a volume of natural philosophy open in her lap, and he stopped in the doorway for a moment before he came in, and she had the impression that the stopping was not surprise, but something else. A hesitation of the kind that is not uncertainty, but rather the pause before a deliberate step. He sat down in the chair across from her and did not pretend he had come for a book. "Tell me something you have been thinking about," he said. She looked at him for a moment. Then she told him what she had been thinking, which was whether the author's argument about the distribution of heat in enclosed spaces was correct, given what she had observed about the eastern rooms of the house, which retained warmth differently from the western ones. And they talked about it for an hour. About the house and the way stone held cold, and the way fires drew differently depending on the orientation of the chimney. And he knew the house in the way that a person who has grown up in a building knows it, in its particular domestic intimacies, and she knew it in the way a person who has observed it very carefully from below knows it, and the conversation moved between those two kinds of knowing in a way that she had not expected. He was not performing interest. She had been around enough performed interest to recognize it, and this was not it. He was genuinely engaged. He sat forward slightly in his chair, his elbows on his knees, his hands loose, and he argued with her at one point, gently, about the western windows, and she argued back, and he conceded one point and held another, and they both knew she was right about the eastern rooms, and the knowing lived in the air between them without being named. When the clock struck 10, He stood and said good night, and she stood and said good night. And he went to the door and stopped with his hand on the frame. "Miss Finch," he said, without turning around. She waited. "I am glad," he said, "that you took the position." Then he left, and she stood in the library for a moment, her hands not quite steady, and then she opened the book again and tried to find the passage she had been reading, and could not. She was not a woman who permitted herself to be foolish about these things. Between a village girl and a duke was a distance that evening conversation in a library did not close, and she was honest enough with herself to know that warmth was not the same as intention. She continued to come to the library on Tuesday evenings. March arrived, and with it a letter from London that brought the dowager's mood to a point of decisive clarity that Nora had been watching approach for several weeks. The letter was from the Moorfields, and its contents were, if the change in Lady Cecilia's posture when she read it was any guide, either deeply pleasing or deeply alarming. Given what followed, Nora concluded it had been the former. Lady Cecilia summoned Edmund to her sitting room that evening, which was unusual, and the summons had the quality of a transaction rather than a social call. The quality of someone settling accounts. Nora was in the adjacent dressing room, which connected to the sitting room by a door that was not quite closed, and she heard what was said in the sitting room, not because she had positioned herself to hear it, but because the acoustics of old stone houses carry sound with uncomfortable clarity. "The Moorfields are ready to move forward," Lady Cecilia said. "Lavinia will be in London for the season. I have told them you will call before the 15th. A silence. "I had not agreed to call," the Duke said. "Edmund!" Lady Cecilia's voice was the voice of a woman who has invested 40 years in the correct management of a family and expects her investments to be honored. "Harriet is gone. The annulment has been processed. The house requires a mistress, and the estate requires an heir. And Lavinia Moorfield is a perfectly suitable young woman who will do both with competence and without complaint. I am not asking you to fall in love. I am asking you to do what the position requires." A longer silence. "Mother," he said, "you were the one who chose Harriet." "Yes," Lady Cecilia said without apology. "And she was a suitable choice. The families were well matched and the arrangement was appropriate. That it did not succeed in other respects does not mean that the principle was wrong. It did not suit her," he said, and his voice was very quiet. "Whatever its other virtues, it did not suit her." "No," Lady Cecilia said, "it did not." Another pause, and in the pause was something more careful, something that was not indifference. "I am sorry for that. I did not fully understand at the time what was being asked of either of you." A silence. It was a different quality of silence than the others. It held something unresolved between them, something that was not quite repentance and not quite forgiveness, but was moving in the direction of both. "I will not call on the Moorfields," he said. "Not before the 15th, not after it. I am going to ask you to trust me in this." "Edmund," she said. "I am going to ask you to trust me," he said again, very quietly. And the repetition had the character of a closing door, the kind that, once closed, stays closed. She heard his footsteps leave the room. She heard Lady Cecilia sit down in the chair that creaked slightly at the leg. She heard the dowager set down her teacup with a precise sound on the saucer. And then she heard, in the dressing room where she had not moved, the sound of a woman deciding whether to adjust her position or hold it. She heard Lady Cecilia exhale. A long, deliberate breath. She heard the teacup set down again, more gently this time. She did not see him until the following morning, in the corridor outside the library, when they nearly crossed each other's path at the turning and both stopped, very close, close enough that she was aware of the warmth of him in the cold corridor, the wool of his coat, the faint scent of wood smoke and paper that had come to be as familiar to her as the smell of the house itself. He looked at her. She looked at him. The corridor was otherwise empty. "I would like to walk," he said. "Would you walk with me?" She said she would. They walked in the garden, which was bleak and gray in the early March cold, the beds bare and the hedges cut back for winter, the stone paths dusted with frost that had not yet lifted in the morning shade. They walked side by side at a distance that was proper and that she was very aware of, and they talked about nothing of consequence for the first few minutes, and she let him take the time he was taking, because she had learned by now that Edmund Wyndham arrived at things by the paths he chose rather than the ones that were most direct. He stopped at the stone bench at the far end of the garden, near the wall that faced the fields, and turned to look at her. "I owe you a great deal," he said. She said he owed her nothing, Your Grace. "You were kind to Harriet," he said. "You gave her something this house failed to give her, which was a person who saw her clearly and stayed anyway. I am not going to pretend that does not matter." He looked at her steadily, with the pewter attention that she had stopped trying to read as anything other than what it was, which was the look of a man who looked at things directly because he had learned, at some cost, to do otherwise. "And you were honest when honesty was required, and discreet when discretion was required, and those are not the same virtue, and you exercised both of them well." She said she had only done what was right. "Yes," he said. "People who only do what is right are rarer than the phrase suggests." She looked at him, and he looked at her, and the frost on the garden was very white in the pale morning sun, and somewhere in the bare branches of the lime tree above the wall a bird was singing, the thin bright song of very early spring. "I am going to say something to you," he said. "And I want you to understand that I am not saying it as your employer, and I am not saying it to place you in a position of obligation. I am saying it because I have been carrying it for 3 months, and because I am, at this point in my life, not willing to carry things silently when there is an alternative." She waited. "I think about you," he said simply. "I think about you a great deal. I think about the library on Tuesday evenings, and about the way you argued with me about the windows, and about the 14 months you spent in this house being the cleverest person in it, and being called the village girl. I think about the fact that you told me Lady Harriet wished her sister well when you did not have to tell me anything, and that you gave the testimony when you had every reason not to. And I think about the fact that you are standing in my garden in the cold, in your plain gray coat, looking at me as if you are waiting for me to arrive at the thing I am trying to say." She was, she realized, smiling. Very slightly. She pressed her lips together and stopped. "I am not Lavinia Moorfield," she said. "No," he said. "You are not. I am not from a good family. I have no portion and no connections, and I read books from the lower shelves of your library with your steward's permission." "Yes," he said. "I know." "Your mother believes I have overstepped my station," she said. "My mother," he said, "believes a great many things that are occasionally worth examining." A pause. "She told me this morning that you are the most capable woman in the household." Nora looked at him. "She said it as a complaint," he said. "I want you to know that." The smile came back, properly this time, and she let it come because she could not quite stop it. And he saw it, and something in his face changed in the way it had changed in the study in December, the deep structural shift that moved through the controlled surface like a current. And this time she did not look away. "I am not asking anything of you today," he said. "I want to be clear about that. I am only telling you that I think about you, and that I intend to go on thinking about you, and that if there comes a time when you are willing to tell me what you think about, I would very much like to know." She looked at the frost on the stones and the bare garden and the gray sky with its thin, bright strip of morning sun. "I think about the eastern rooms," she said, "and the distribution of heat in enclosed spaces, and whether you will concede the point about the eastern windows, because I was right, and I am waiting for you to arrive at it." He laughed. It was a low, genuine sound, surprised out of him, and it changed his face entirely. And she stood very still inside the change of it, because she had not heard it before. And it was, she thought, the thing she had been waiting for, without knowing she was waiting for it. They walked back to the house in the gray cold, side by side, at a proper distance, the frost white on the stones and the birds still singing in the bare lime tree, and she did not touch his hand, and he did not touch hers, and they walked up the steps and through the door, and into the warmth of the house that had been only a stone presence on a hill above her father's farm 3 years ago. And it felt, walking through its door, like something else entirely. It felt like the beginning of a question she was finally willing to ask. The answer arrived in April. It arrived in the small formal sitting room where Lady Cecilia received callers, on a morning when Nora had arranged the flowers and set the correspondence to one side, and was preparing to withdraw. And Lady Cecilia said, without looking up from the letter in her hand, "Sit down, girl." Nora sat. Lady Cecilia finished reading the letter, set it down with care, and looked at Nora Finch for a long, measuring moment. It was the look she had given her on the day of her arrival, in the entrance hall, in front of the assembled staff. The look that assessed proportions and found them slightly wrong. This time the proportions had changed. "My son," Lady Cecilia said, "has informed me of his intentions." Nora said nothing. "He is," Lady Cecilia said, "apparently determined." A pause. "He has told me that the village girl who reads books and gave evidence for the annulment of his first marriage is the person he intends to court, with a view toward a second marriage, and that I am to adjust my expectations accordingly." Nora held her hands still in her lap. "I told him," Lady Cecilia said, "that it was inappropriate." Nora said she understood, my lady. He told me," Lady Cecilia said, "that I had spent 20 years managing appropriate marriages, and the results had been, on the whole, unfortunate." She looked at Nora with an expression that was very close to something that was not quite respect, but was its near neighbor. He was not wrong. A silence. "I do not intend," Lady Cecilia said, "to welcome you warmly. I want to be honest with you, because you are apparently the kind of person who prefers honesty, which is an aggravating quality in a servant, and possibly acceptable in a daughter-in-law. I will not be easy. I will notice everything you do, and I will have opinions about a great deal of it." Nora said, with considerable care, that she was aware of that, my lady. She set down the letter. "My son has asked me to look at you clearly, and I have looked. And you are not what I intended, and you are not what the position ordinarily requires, and you are not from a good family, and you have nothing that the position traditionally demands." A pause. "You are also, as I told him this morning, the most capable person in this household, which is an inconvenient fact, but I have no intention of quarreling with facts." She picked up the letter again. "You may go," she said. "My son is in the garden." He was in the garden, as Lady Cecilia had said, standing at the far wall near the stone bench where they had talked in March, looking out over the fields to the valley below. The spring had come to the garden in the weeks since then, the beds showing green and the lime tree in leaf, and the morning light was the clear gold of early April, the kind that makes gray stone look warm and distances look closer than they are. She came across the garden to him and stopped beside him, looking out at the valley. "Your mother has spoken to me," she said. "Yes," he said. "I know." She looked at the valley, the green of it, the pale gold of the fields, the thin line of the river in the distance catching the light. "She said she would not be easy," Nora said. "She will not," he said. "She said she had no intention of welcoming me warmly." "She said the same to me," he said. "I told her that warmth would come." She looked at him. He was looking at the valley, and the morning light was on the side of his face. And she saw in it, in the set of his jaw and the steadiness of his eyes, the thing she had been learning to read across the winter, the thing that looked like coldness from a distance, and was, up close, the composed discipline of a man who had made very few choices freely, and had decided to make one now. "Miss Finch," he said, and then corrected himself quietly. "Nora." She waited. "I am asking," he said, and the simplicity of it was its own kind of weight, "whether you will allow me to court you." She looked at the valley and the river, and the gold of the morning fields. "I have allowed it for some time, Your Grace," she said. He turned to look at her, and she turned to look at him. And they stood in the April garden at Ashbourne Park, the lime tree in new leaf above the wall, and the frost entirely gone, and she put her hand in his, and he held it. And neither of them said anything for a long time. They were married in June, very quietly, in the village church at the foot of the hill, with Briggs and his wife as witnesses, and Lady Cecilia in the first pew in her finest black silk, upright and composed and wearing, on her lapel, a small spray of white roses that no one had suggested and no one commented on. Nora wore a cream gown that she had made herself from fabric Briggs had ordered from the town, empire-waisted and simply trimmed, and she carried a single stem of the lily of the valley that grew in the corner of the walled garden where she and Edmund had sat in April and said the things they had been carrying since November. She did not look like a woman who had overstepped her station. She looked like a woman who had stood very still in her category and waited for the world to come to its senses. By Christmas, the eastern rooms of Ashbourne Park had been rehung with new curtains, and the fireplaces cleared and reset by the chimney sweep from the village, and the rooms held warmth the way they had always, according to Nora's theory, been meant to hold it. Edmund conceded the point about the windows in October, formally, over breakfast, without ceremony, which was exactly how she had known it would arrive. Lady Cecilia came to the house at Christmas and sat by the fire in the great drawing-room and drank her tea with both hands on the cup. And she looked at her son, who was reading in the chair across from his wife, who was reading beside the east window in the good morning light. And she said nothing, which was its own kind of adjustment. The worn ledger that Nora had carried through the house in October, counting candles in a household of silences, sat on the shelf in the library between the natural philosophy and the household accounts, in the space she had cleared for it on the day she moved her few belongings into the room that was now hers. She had not thrown it away. It was, she thought, the record of a particular kind of attention, the attention of a woman who had been told she was marginal and had kept her ledger anyway, noting what she observed, trusting the Count. Edmund found it one evening in January, the new year already, the fire lit and the snow falling past the library window in the long, slow way of deep winter snow. He took it down and opened it to the first page, where her handwriting began in its careful columns. He looked at it for a moment. "This is from October," he said. "The morning after the funeral," she said, without looking up from her book. He turned a few pages. He closed it gently and set it back on the shelf in the space she had made for it. "The cleverest person in the house," he said quietly, to no one in particular, or to her, which was the same thing now. The snow went on falling past the window, white and silent, and the fire was warm. And outside the high stone walls of Ashbourne Park, the county lay still and cold under its winter cover, and inside the library, two people read in the good, steady light of the evening, and neither of them was alone.